Welcome to Grammar, y'all. Today, we're going to talk about restrictive and non-restrictive phrases and clauses. First, I'm going to tell you which grammatical constructions we need to think about when it comes to restrictive and non-restrictive. Then, I'm going to give you a definition. We'll go over some hacks. We'll look at it through a rhetorical lens. And then I'm going to finish with just a little bit of a rant about why this particular grammar rule drives me crazy. First of all, there are 4 grammatical constructions that we need to consider when it comes to restrictive and non-restrictive. And all 4 grammatical constructions either modify a noun or rename a noun. Prepositional phrases, participial phrases, appositive phrases, and the adjectival dependent clause. Now, I've looked at a lot of standardized tests and a lot of standardized curricula over the years, and I have never seen restrictive and non-restrictive discussed with prepositional phrases. I've almost never seen it discussed with participial phrases. Every once in a while, you'll see it discussed with appositive phrases. But the place I see it discussed most often is with adjectival dependent clauses. Let's look at the definition of what restrictive and non-restrictive really means. So if you have a restrictive phrase or clause, then you need to think about the fact that this information is considered essential to the meaning of the sentence. So you don't put commas around it. If it's non-restrictive, it means that it is not essential to the meaning of the sentence, so you put commas around it. Now, I have often found that restrictive and non-restrictive can be very confusing to students. And so I like to introduce it with the terms essential and non-essential. If it's essential, you don't need commas. If it's non-essential, you do need commas. That seems to be an easier way to introduce this to adolescents. One of the arguments for why we need to teach essential and non-essential, or restrictive and non-restrictive, is that with the commas, the meaning changes. So let's look at an example just to kind of get an overall idea of what this argument is all about. And we're going to use the sentence, the book that you recommended is sold out, and the book which you recommended is sold out. So people who love restrictive and non-restrictive, this is what they're going to argue, that when you use the restrictive, that is the essential, that what you're saying is that there is more than one book under consideration and that specific one is sold out. Whereas when you use the non-restrictive or the non-essential which, you're saying something different. You're saying there's only one book in this particular context, and the fact that you recommended it is extra information. So the idea of why we need to teach it is that the meaning changes. I'm not sure if I believe that. So I'm going to show you 2 hacks that you can teach your students when it comes to restrictive and non-restrictive. The first one is the removal test. Let's look at 2 sentences. The poet Langston Hughes wrote about Harlem. The poet wrote about Harlem. The phrase that we're questioning right there is an appositive phrase, Langston Hughes, and we're questioning, do we need that name, that appositive, for this sentence to make sense? Well, actually, here we absolutely do. So without it, we don't know which poet we're referring to. Therefore, it is restrictive. That is, it is essential, and we do not need commas. The second hack we can thank H.W. Fowler for. He wrote a grammar book in 1926, and in this book he said, if that begins an adjectival dependent clause, it is restrictive. That is, it is essential, and you do not need commas. But if you use which to begin an adjectival dependent clause, it is non-restrictive. That is, it is non-essential and you need a comma. So the hack is this. If it's an adjectival dependent clause that begins with that, don't use a comma. If it's an adjectival dependent clause that begins with which, use a comma. These 2 hacks will help you out a large percentage of the time. But I'm still arguing that we need to bring every grammatical construction to our students with a rhetorical lens, with a why is this important? So the first one we can consider is restrictive and non-restrictive can indicate a shared knowledge between the writer and the reader. So let's look at two sentences as an example. If I said, my sister Marie is coming to dinner, I know that I have more than one sister if I don't put commas around it. If I do put commas around it, my reader already knows which sister is coming to dinner. So there's this idea of shared knowledge. The other rhetorical lens that we can bring to restrictive and non-restrictive phrases and clauses is the idea of inclusion versus exclusion. Let's look at two sentences. The teachers who support the reform spoke publicly. If we use this phrase, who support the reform, restrictively, we're saying only a few teachers supported the reform. But if we use it in a non-restrictive manner, if we add commas, we're saying that all of the teachers supported the reform. Honestly, I really struggled with making this video. I feel like restrictive and non-restrictive, essential and non-essential, like this is grammar trivia, right? And I've never seen it actually asked in any trivia. But it's easy to test, which is why we see it again and again. I get frustrated because often the information that we need to decide whether a phrase or clause is essential or non-essential is in the larger context, in the sentences before it and the sentences after it. And so when we take out one sentence and ask students to decide whether it's restrictive or non-restrictive, that's not really how language works in the real world. And so I get frustrated. But I think it's important knowledge for you to have because it is tested. So I do hope this video was helpful. Thanks so much for joining me today. Y'all take care of yourselves.